The Adventure of the Cardboard Box. In choosing a few typical cases which illustrate the remarkable mental qualities of my friend Sherlock Holmes, I have endeavored, so far as possible, to select those which presented the minimum of sensationalism while offering a fair field for his talents. It is, however, unfortunately, impossible entirely to separate the sensational from the criminal, and a chronicler is left in the dilemma that he must either sacrifice details which are essential to his statement, or so give a false impression of the problem, or he must use matter which chance and not choice has provided him with. With a short preface, I shall turn to my notes of what proved to be a strange, though particularly terrible, chain of events. It was a blazing hot day in August. Baker Street was like an oven, and the glare of the sunlight upon the yellow brickwork of the houses across the street was painful to the eye. It was hard to believe that these were the same walls which illumined so gloomily through the fogs of winter. Our blinds were half drawn, and Holmes lay curled upon the sofa, reading and rereading a letter which he had received by the morning post. For myself, my term of service in India had trained me to stand heat better than cold, and the thermometer at 90 was of no hardship. But the morning paper was uninteresting. Parliament had risen, everybody was out of town, and I yearned for the glades of the New Forest or a shingle of the South Sea. A depleted bank account had caused me to postpone my holiday, and as to my companion, neither the country nor the sea presented the slightest attraction to him. He loved to lie in the very center of 5 millions of people, with his filaments stretching out and reaching through them, responsive to every little rumor or suspicion of unsolved crime. Appreciation of nature found no place among his many gifts, and his only change was when he turned his mind from the evildoer of the town to track down his brother of the country. Finding that Holmes was too absorbed for conversation, I had tossed aside the barren paper, and, leaning back in my chair, I fell into a brown study. Suddenly my companion's voice broke in upon my thoughts. "You're right, Watson," said he. "It does not seem to be Prosper's way of settling a dispute." "Most preposterous," I exclaimed, then suddenly realizing how he had echoed the inmost thought of my soul, I sat up in my chair and stared at him in blank astonishment. "What is it, Holmes?" I cried. "This is beyond anything which I could have imagined." He laughed heartily at my perplexity. "You remember," said he, "that some little time ago, when I read you the passage of one of Poe's sketches, in which a close reasoner follows the unspoken thoughts of his companion, you were inclined to treat the matter as a mere tour de force for the author. On my remarking that I was consistently in the habit of doing the same thing, you expressed incredulity." "Oh, no." "Perhaps not with your tongue, my dear Watson, but certainly with your eyebrows. So when I saw you throw down your paper and enter your train of thought, I was very happy to have the opportunity of reading it off, and eventually of breaking into it, as a proof that I had been in rapport with you." But I was still far from satisfied. "In the example which you read to me," I said, "the reasoner drew his conclusions from the actions of the man whom he observed. If I remember right, he stumbled upon a heap of stones, looked up at the stairs, and so on. But I have been seated quietly in this chair. What clues have I given you?" "You do yourself an injustice. The features are given to man by the means by which he shall express his emotions, and yours are faithful servants." "Do you mean to say that you read my train of thoughts from my features?" "Your features, and especially your eyes. Perhaps you cannot recall yourself how your reverie commenced?" "No, I cannot." "Then I will tell you. After throwing down your paper, which was the action which drew my attention to you, you sat for half a minute with a vacant expression. Then your eyes fixed themselves upon your newly framed picture of General Gordon, and I saw by the alternation of your face that the train of thought had been started. But it did not lead very far. Your eyes flashed to the unframed portrait of Henry Ward Beecher, which stands upon the top of your books. Then you glanced up at the wall, and of course your meaning was obvious. You are thinking that if the portrait were framed, it would just cover the bare space and correspond with Gordon's picture over there. "You have followed me wonderfully," I exclaimed. "So far I could hardly have gone astray, but you now have your thoughts back to Beecher, and you looked hard across as if you were studying the character of his features. Then your eyes ceased to pucker, and you continued to look across, and your face was thoughtful. You were recalling incidents of Beecher's career. I was well aware that you could not do this without thinking of the mission which you undertook on behalf of the North at the time of the Civil War, for I remember your expression of passionate indignation at the way in which he was received by the more turbulent of our people. You felt strongly about it. That I knew that you could not think of Beecher without thinking of that also. When a moment later I saw your eye wander away from the picture, I suspected your mind had now turned to the Civil War, and when I observed that your lips set, your eyes sparkled, and your hands clenched, I was positive that you were indeed thinking of the gallantry which was shown by both sides in that desperate struggle. But then, again, your face grew sadder. You shook your head. You were dwelling upon the sadness and horror and useless waste of life. Your hand stole toward your own old wound, and a smile quivered on your lips, which showed me that the ridiculous side of this method of settling international questions had forced itself upon your mind. At this point I agreed with you that it was preposterous, and was glad to find that all my deductions had been correct. "Absolutely," said I. "And now that you have explained it, I confess that I am as amazed as before." "It is very superficial, my dear Watson, I assure you. I should not have intruded it upon your attention had you not shown some incredulity the other day. But I have in my hands here a little problem which may prove to be more difficult of a solution than my small essay of thought-reading. Have you observed in the paper a short paragraph referring to remarkable contents of a packet sent through the post to Miss Cushing of Cross Street, Croydon?" "I saw nothing." "Ah, then you have overlooked it. Just toss it over to me. Here it is, under the financial column. Perhaps you would be good enough to read it aloud." I picked up the paper which he had thrown back to me, and read the paragraph indicated. It was headed, "A Gruesome Packet." "Miss Susan Cushing, living at Cross Street, Croydon, has been made the victim of what must be regarded as a peculiarly revolting practical joke, unless some more sinister meaning should prove to be attached to the incident. At 2 o'clock yesterday, a small packet, wrapped in brown paper, was handed in by the postman. A cardboard box was inside, which was filled with coarse salt. On emptying this, Miss Cushing was horrified to find 2 human ears, apparently quite freshly severed. The box had been sent by parcel post from Belfast upon the morning before. There is no indication to the sender, and the matter is the more mysterious as Miss Cushing, who is a maiden lady of 50, has led a most retired life, and has had so few acquaintances or correspondences that it is a rare event for her to receive anything through the post. Some years ago, however, when she resided in Penge, she let apartments in her house to 3 young medical students, whom she was obliged to get rid of on account of their noisy and irregular habits. The police are of opinion that this outrage may have been perpetrated upon Miss Cushing by these youths, who owed her a grudge, and who hoped to frighten her by sending her these relics of the dissecting rooms. Some probability is lent to the theory by the fact that one of the students came from north of Ireland, and to the best of Miss Cushing's belief, from Belfast. In the meantime, the matter of being actively investigated, Lestrade, one of the very smartest of our detective officers, being in charge of the case." "So much for the Daily Chronicle," said Holmes as I finished reading. "Now, for our friend Lestrade. I had a note from him this morning, in which says, 'I think that this case is very much on your line. We have every hope of clearing the matter up, but we find a little difficulty in getting anything upon to work. We have, of course, wired to the Belfast post office, but a large number of parcels were handed in upon that day, and they have no means of identifying this particular one, or of remembering the sender. The box is a half-pound box of honeydew tobacco, and does not help us in any way. The medical student theory still appears to me to be the most feasible, but if you should have a few hours to spare, I should be very happy to see you out here. I shall be either at the house or in the police station all day. What say you to that, Watson? Can you rise superior to the heat, and run down to the Croydon with me on the off chance of a case for your annals?
I was longing for something to do.
You shall have it, then. Ring for your boots and tell them to order a cab. I'll be back in a moment when I have changed my dressing gown and filled my cigar case.
A shower of rain fell while we were on the train, and the heat was less oppressive in Croydon than in town. Holmes had sent a wire to Lestrade. It's wiry and dapple, as ferret-like as ever, was waiting for us at the station. A walk of 5 minutes took us to Cross Street, where Miss Cushing's resided. It was a very long street of 2-story brick houses, neat and prim, with whitened stone steps and little groups of aproned women gossiping at the doors. Halfway down, Lestrade stopped and tapped at her door, which was opened by a small servant girl. Miss Cushing was sitting in the front room, into which we were ushered. She was a placid-faced woman with large, gentle eyes and grizzled hair curving down over her temples on each side. A work massacre lay upon her lap, and a blanket of colored silk stood upon the stool beside her.
"There in the outhouse, those dreadful things," she said, as Lestrade entered. "I wish that you would take them away altogether."
So I shall, Miss Cushing. I only kept them there here until my friend Mr. Holmes should see them in your presence.
"Why in my presence, sir?"
In case he wished to ask you anything.
"What is the use of asking me questions when I tell you I know nothing whatever about it?"
"Quite so, madam," said Holmes in his soothing way. "I have no doubt that you have been annoyed more than enough already over this business."
"Indeed, sir, I have. I am a quiet woman and live a retired life. It is something new for me to see my name in the papers and to find police in my house. I won't have those things in here, Mr. Lestrade. If you wish to see them, you must go to the outhouse."
It was a small shed with a narrow garden which ran behind the house. Lestrade went in and brought out a yellow cardboard box with a piece of brown paper and some string. There was a bench at the end of the path, and we sat down as Holmes examined, one by one, the articles which Lestrade handed to him.
"This string is exceedingly interesting," he remarked, holding up tight and sniffing at it. "What do you make of this string, Lestrade?"
"It's been tarred."
"Precisely. It is a piece of tarred twine. You have also, no doubt, remarked that Miss Cushing has cut the cord with scissors. It can be seen in the double fray on each side. This is of importance."
"I can see nothing of importance," said Lestrade.
"The importance lies in the fact that the knot is left intact, and that this knot is of particular character."
"It is neatly tied. I already made a note of that fact," said Lestrade complacently.
"So much for the string, then," said Holmes, smiling. "Now, for the box wrapper. Brown paper with a distinct smell of coffee. What? Did not observe it? I think there can be no doubt of it. The address printed in rather straggling letters. Miss S. Cushing, Cross Street, Croydon. Done with a double-pointed pen, probably a J, with a very inferior ink. The word Croydon has been originally spelled with an I, which has been changed to a Y. The parcel was directed then by a man. The printing is distinctly masculine, of limited education and unacquainted with the town of Croydon. So far, so good. The box is a yellow half-pound honeydew box, with nothing distinctive save 2 thumb marks at the left bottom corner. It is filled with rough salt of the quantity used for preserving hides and other of the coarser commercial purposes. And embedded in it are these 2 singular enclosures.
He took out the 2 ears as he spoke, laying a board across his knee. He examined them minutely, while Lestrade and I, bending forward on each side of him, glanced alternately at these dreadful relics and at the thoughtful, eager face of our companion. Finally, he returned them to the box once more, and sat for a while in deep meditation.
You have observed, of course, he said at last, that the ears are not a pair.
Yeah, I've noticed that, but if this were a practical joke of some students from the dissecting rooms, it would be as easy for them to send 2 odd pairs as a pair.
Precisely, but this is not a practical joke.
Are you sure of it?
The presumption is strongly against it. Bodies in the dissecting rooms are injected with preservation fluid. These ears bear no signs of this. They are fresh, too. They have been cut off with a blunt instrument, which would hardly happen if a student had done it. Again, carbolic or rectified spirits would have been in the preservatives, which would suggest themselves to the medical mind. Certainly not rough salt. I repeat that there is no practical joke here, but that we are investigating a serious crime.
A vague thrill ran through me as I listened to my companion's words and saw the stern gravity which had hardened his features. This brutal preliminary seemed to shadow forth some strange and inexplicable horror in the background. Lestrade, however, shook his head like a man who is only half convinced.
These are objections to the joke theory, no doubt, said he, but there are much stronger reasons against the other. We know that this woman has led a most quiet and respectable life of Penge for the past 20 years. She has hardly been away from her home for a day during that time. Why on earth, then, should any criminal send her the proofs of her guilt, especially as, unless she is of most consummate actress, she understands quite a little of the matter as we do?
That is a problem which we have to solve, Holmes answered. And as for my part, I shall set out presuming that my reasoning is correct, and that a double murder has been committed. One of these ears is a woman's, small, finely formed, and pierced with an earring. The other is a man, sunburned, discolored, and also pierced with an earring. These 2 people are presumably dead, or we should have heard a story by now. Today is Friday. The package was posted on Thursday morning. The tragedy, then, occurred on Wednesday or Tuesday, or earlier. If the 2 people were murdered, but who or their murderer may have sent this as a work to Miss Cushing. May I take it that the sender of the packet is a man whom we want? But he must have some strong reasoning for sending Miss Cushing this packet. What reason, then? It must have been to tell her that the deed was done, or to pain her, perhaps. But in this case she knows who it is. Does she know? I doubt it. If she knew, why should she call the police in? She might have buried the ears, and no one would have been the wiser. What is it that this she has done if she wished to shield the criminal? But if she does not wish to shield him, she would give his name. There's a tangle here which needs straightening out. He had been talking in a high, quick voice, staring blankly out over the garden fence, and now he sprang briskly to his feet and walked towards the house. "I have a few questions to ask Miss Cushing," said he. "In that case I may leave you here," said Lestrade, "for I have another small business matter at hand. I think that I have nothing further to learn from Miss Cushing. You'll find me at the police station." "We shall look in on our way to the train," answered Holmes. A moment later, he and I were back in the front room, where the impassive lady was still quietly working away at her antimascara. She put it down on her lap as we entered, looking at us with her frank, searching blue eyes. "I'm convinced, sir," she said, "that this matter is a mistake, and that the parcel was never meant for me at all.
I've said this several times to the gentleman from Scotland Yard, but he simply laughs at me. I would not have an enemy in the world as far as I know, so why should anyone play me such a trick?
I'm coming to be about the same opinion, Miss Cushing, said Holmes, taking a seat beside her. I think that is more probable. He paused, and I was surprised on glancing around to see that he was staring at a singular intentness at the lady's profile. Surprise and satisfaction were both for an instant to be read upon his eager face, though when she glanced round to find that the case of his silence he had become as demure as ever. I stared hard myself at her flat, grizzled hair, her prim cap, and her little glint earrings of placid features, but I could see nothing which would account for my companion's evident excitement. And there are one or two questions.
Oh, I'm very weary of questions,
cried Miss Cushing impatiently.
You have 2 sisters, I believe.
How could you know that?
I observed the very instant that I entered the room that you have a portrait group of 3 ladies upon the mantelpiece, one of whom is undoubtedly yourself, while the others are so exceedingly like you that there could be no doubt of the relationship.
You are quite right. Those are my sisters, Sarah and Mary.
And here at the elbow is another portrait, taken at Liverpool, of your younger sister, in the company of a man who appears to be steward by his uniform. I observed that she was unmarried at the time.
You are very quick at observing.
That is my trade.
Well, you're quite right, but she is married to Mr. Browner a few days afterwards. He was on South American land that was taken, and he was so fond of her that he couldn't abide to leave her for so long, and he got into the Liverpool and London boats.
Ah, the Conqueror, perhaps.
No, the Mayday, when I heard last. Jim came down here to see me once. That was before he broke the pledge, but afterwards we would always take drink when he was ashore, and a little drink would send him stark raving mad. It was a bad day that he took a glass in his hand again. First he dropped me, then he quarreled with Sarah, and now that Mary has stopped writing, we don't know how things are going with them.
It was evident that Miss Cushing had come upon the subject on which she felt very deeply. Like most people who lead a lonely life, she was shy at first, but ended by becoming extremely communicative. She told us many details about her brother-in-law, the steward, and then wandering off on the subject of her former lodgers, the medical students, she gave us a long account of their delinquencies, with their names and those of their hospitals. Holmes listened attentively to everything, throwing in a question from time to time.
About your second sister, Sarah, he said, I wonder, since you are both maiden ladies, that you do not keep house together.
You don't know Sarah's temper, or you would wonder no more. I tried it when I came to Croydon, and we kept on until about 2 months ago, when she had to part. I didn't want to say a word against my own sister, but she was always meddlesome and hard to please with Sarah.
You say that she quarreled with your Liverpool relations.
Yes, and they were the best friends at one time. Why, she went up there to live in order to be near them, and now she has no word from either Jordan Browner. The last 6 months that she was here, she would always speak of nothing but his drinking and his ways. He had caught her meddling, I suspect, and given her a bit of his mind, and that was the start of it.
Thank you, Miss Cushing, said Holmes, rising and bowing. Your sister Sarah lives, I think you said, at New Street, Wallington. Goodbye, and I am very sorry that you should have been troubled over a case with which, as you say, you have nothing whatever to do.
There was a cab passing as we came out, and Holmes hailed it.
How far to Wellington? He asked.
About a mile, sir.
Very good. Jump in, Watson. We must strike while the iron is hot. Simple as this case is, there have been 1 or 2 very instructive details in connection with it. Just pull up at the telegraph office as you pass by, cabby.
Holmes sent off a short wire, and for the rest of the drive lay back in the cab with his hat
tilted over his nose to keep the sun off his face. Our driver pulled up at the house, which was not unlike the one which we had just quitted. My companion ordered him to wait, and had his hand upon the knocker when the door opened, and a grave young gentleman in black, with a very shiny hat, appeared on the step.
"Is Miss Cushing at home?" asked Holmes. "Miss Sarah Cushing is extremely ill," he said. "She has been suffering since yesterday from brain symptoms of great severity. As her medical adviser, I cannot possibly take the responsibility of allowing anyone to see her. I should recommend you to call again in 10 days.
He drew on his gloves, closed the door, and marched off down the street.
"Well, if we can't, we can't," said Holmes cheerfully.
"Perhaps we should not, or would not, have told you much."
"I did not wish her to tell me anything. I only wanted to look at her. However, I think that I have got all that I want. Drive us at some decent hotel cabby, where we may have some lunch, and afterwards we shall drop down upon friend Lestrade at the police station."
We had a pleasant little meal together, during which Holmes would talk about nothing but violins, narrating with great exultation how he had purchased his own Stradivarius, which was worth at least 500 guineas, at the Jew brokers in Tottenham Court Road for 55 shillings. This led him to Paganini, and we sat for an hour over a bottle of claret while he told me an anecdote after anecdote of the extraordinary man. The afternoon was far advanced, and the hot glare had softened into a mellow glow before we found ourselves at the police station. Lestrade was waiting for us at the door.
"A telegram for you, Mr. Holmes," said he. "Ah, it is an answer."
He tore it open and glanced his eyes over it, and crumpled it into his pocket.
"That's all right," said he. "Have you found anything?" "I have found everything."
"What?" Lestrade stared at him in amazement.
"You're joking." "I was never more serious in my life. A shocking crime has been committed, and now I think we have laid bare every detail of it."
"And the criminal?" Holmes scribbled a few words upon the back of his visiting cards and threw it over to Lestrade.
"That is the name," he said. "You cannot effect arrest until tomorrow night at the earliest. I should prefer that you do not mention my name at all in connection with this case, as I choose to only be associated with those crimes which present some difficulty in their solution. Come on, Watson."
We strode off together to the station, leaving Lestrade still staring with a delighted face at the card which Holmes had thrown at him.
"The case,"
said Sherlock Holmes as we chattered over cigars on our night in our rooms at Baker Street,
"is one where, as in the investigations which you have chronicled under the names of Study in Scarlet and of the Sign of Four, we have been compelled to reason backwards from effects to causes. I have written to Lestrade exactly asking him to supply us with the details which are now waiting, and which he will only get after he has secured his man. That he may be safely trusted to, for although he is absolutely devoid of reason, he is as tenacious as a bulldog when he once understands what he has to do, and indeed it is just this tenacity which has brought him up to the top of Scotland Yard."
"Your case is not complete, then?" I asked.
"It is fairly complete in essentials. We know who the author of the revolting business is, although one of the victims still escapes us. Of course, you have formed your own conclusions."
"I presume that this Jim Browner, the steward of a Liverpool boat, is a man whom you suspect."
"Oh, it is more than a suspicion."
"And yet I cannot see anything save for the vague indications."
"On the contrary, to my mind nothing could be more clear. Let me run over the principal steps. We approach the case, you remember, with an absolutely blank mind, which is always an advantage. We have formed no theories. We are simply there to observe and to draw inferences from our observations. What do we see first? A very placid and respectable lady, whom seemed quite innocent of any secret, and a portrait which showed me that she had 2 younger sisters. And instantly flashed across my mind that this box might have been meant for one of these. I set the idea aside as one which could be disproved or confirmed at our leisure. Then we went to the garden. As you remember, and we saw the very singular contents of a little yellow box. The string was of the quantity used by sailmakers aboard ship, and at once a whiff of the sea was perceptible to our investigation. When I observed that the knot was one which is popular with sailors, and that the parcel had been posted at a port, and that the male ear was pierced for an earring, which is so much more common among sailors than landsmen, I was quite certain that all the actors in the tragedy were to be found among our seafaring classes. When I came to examine the address on the packet, I observed that it was to Miss S. Cushing. Now, the older sister, of course, would be Miss Cushing, and although her initial is S, it might belong to one of the others as well. In that case, we should have commenced our investigation from a fresh bias altogether. I therefore went into the house with the intention of clearing up this point. I was so sure that Miss Cushing that I was convinced that the mistake had been made, and you may remember that I suddenly came to a stop. The fact was that I had just seen something which filled me with surprise, and at the same time narrowed the field of our inquiry immensely. As a medical man, you are aware, Watson, that there are no parts of the body which vary so much as a human ear. Which ear is, as a rule, quite distinctive, and differs from one all of the others. In last year's Anthropological Journal, you will find 2 short monographs from my pen upon the subject. I had therefore examined the ears in the box with the eyes of an expert, and I carefully noted their anatomical particularities. Imagine my surprise, then, when looking at Miss Cushing, I perceived that her ear corresponded exactly with the female ear in which I had just inspected. The matter was entirely beyond coincidence. There was the same shortening of the pinna, the same broad curve of the upper lobe, the same convulsion of the inner cartilage. In all essentials, it was the same ear. Of course, I at once saw the enormous importance of the observation. It was evidence that the victim's was a blood relation, and probably a very close one. I began to talk to her about her family, and you remember that she at once gave us some exceedingly valuable details. In the first place, her sister's name was Sarah, and her address had, until recently, been the same, so that it was quite obvious the mistake had occurred, and for whom the packet was truly meant. Then we heard of the steward married to the third sister, and learned that he had at one time been so intimate with Miss Sarah that he had actually gone up to Liverpool to be near the Browners, but a quarrel had afterwards divided them. This quarrel had put a stop to all communications for some months, so that if Browner had the occasion to address a packet to Miss Sarah, he would undoubtedly have done so to her old address. And now the matter had begun to straighten itself out wonderfully. We had learned of the existence of the steward, an impulsive man of strong passions. You remember that he threw up what he must have been a very superior birth, in order to be near to his wife, subject to occasional fits of hard drinking. He had reason to believe that his wife had been murdered, and that a man, presumably a seafaring man, had been murdered at the same time. Jealousy, of course, at once suggests as the motive of the crime. And why should these proofs of the deed be sent to Miss Sarah Cushing? Probably because during her residence in Liverpool she had some hand in bringing about the events which led to the tragedy. You observe that this line of the boats calls at Belfast, Dublin, and Waterford, so that, presuming that Browner had committed the deed, and had embarked at once upon the steamer, the Mayday, Belfast would be in the first place he would post a terrible packet. A second solution was at the stage obviously plausible, that although I thought it exceedingly unlikely, I was determined to elucidate it from going further. An unsuccessful lover might have killed Mr. and Mrs. Browner, and the male writer might have belonged to the husband. There were many grave objections to this theory, but it was conceivable. I therefore sent off a telegram to my friend Alga, of the Liverpool force, and asked him to find out if Miss Browner were at home, and if Browner had departed on the Mayday. Then we went to Wellington to visit Miss Sarah. I was curious in the first place to see how far the family ear had been reproduced in her, but, of course, she might give us some important information. But it was not sanguine that she would. She must have heard of the business of the day before, since all Croydon was ringing about it, and she alone could understand with whom the packet was meant,
If she had been willing to help justice, she probably would have communicated with the police already. However, it was clearly our duty to see her, so we went. We found that the news of the arrival of the packet, for her illness dated from that time, had such an ill effect upon her that to bring her brain fever. It was clearer than ever that she understood its full significance, but equally clear that we should have to wait some time for any assistance from her. However, we were really independent of her help. Our answers were waiting for us at the police station, where I had directed Alga to send them. Nothing could be more conclusive. Miss Browner's house had been closed for more than 3 days, and the neighbors were of the opinion that she had gone south to see her relatives. It had been asserted that the shipping officers in Browner had left aboard the Mayday, and I calculate that she is due in the Thames tomorrow night. When he arrived, he will be met with an obtuse but resolute Lestrade, and I have no doubt that we shall have all the details filled in.
Sherlock Holmes was not disappointed by his expectations. 2 days later he received a bulky envelope which contained a short note from the detective and a typewritten document which covered several pages of foolscap.
"Lestrade has got him all right," said Holmes, glancing at me. "Perhaps it would interest you to hear what he says. Dear Mr. Holmes, in accordance to the scheme which we had formed in order to test our theories, the we is rather fine, Watson, is it not? I went down to the Albert Docks yesterday at 6 p.m. and boarded the SS Mayday, belonging to the Liverpool, Dublin, and London Steam Packet Company. On inquiry, I found that there was a steward on board by the name of James Browner, and that he had acted during the voyage in such an extraordinary manner that the captain had been compelled to relieve him of his duties. On descending to his berth, I found him seated upon a chest with his head sunk upon his hands, rocking himself to and fro. He is a big, powerful chap, clean-shaven and very swarthy, something like an Aldrich, who helped us in the Borgus laundry affair. He jumped up when he heard of my business, and I had to whistle to my lips to call a couple of river police, and were round the corner, but he seemed to have no heart in him, and he held out his hands quietly enough for the Darbies. We brought him along to the cells and in his box as well, for we thought there might be something incriminating. But, bar a big sharp knife, such as most sailors have, we found nothing for our trouble. However, we found that we shall not want for more evidence, for on being brought before the inspector at the station, he asked to leave to make a statement, which was, of course, taken down, just as he made it by our shorthand. We have 3 copies typewritten, one of which I enclose. The affair proves, as I always thought it would, to be an extremely simple one. But I am obliged to you for assisting me in my investigation. With kind regards, yours truly, G. Lestrade. The investigation really was a simple one, remarked Holmes, but I don't think it struck him in that light when he first called us. However, let us see what Jim Browner has to say for himself. Now, this is a statement he made before the Inspector Montgomery at Shadwell Police Station, and it has some advantage of being verbatim. Have I anything to say? Yes. I have to deal today. I have made a clean breast of it all. You can hang me or you can leave me alone. I don't care to plug which you do. I tell you that I've not shut an eye in sleep since I did it, and I don't believe I will ever again until I get past all waking. Sometimes it's his face, but generally it's hers. I'm never without one or the other before me. He looks frowning and black-like, and she has a kind of surprised look upon her face. Aye, the white lamb. She might be as well surprised as she read death on the face that had seldom looked anything but love upon her before. But it was Sarah's fault, and may be the curse of a broken man to put a blight on her and set her blood rotting in her veins. It's not that I want to clear myself. I know that I went back to drink, like the beast I was. But she would have forgiven me. She would not have stuck so close to me as a rope to a block that if a woman had never darkened our door. For Sarah Cushing loved me. That's the root of business. She loved me, till all her love turned to poisonous hate, when she knew that I thought more of my wife's footmark in the mud than I did of her whole body and soul. There were 3 sisters altogether. The old one was just a good woman. The second was a devil. The third was an angel. Sarah was 23, Mary was 29 when I married. We were just as happy as the day was long when we set up house together, and in Liverpool there was no better woman than in my Mary. And when she asked Sarah up for a week, the week grew into a month, and then one thing led to another, until she was just one of ourselves. I was a blue ribbon at the time, and we were putting a little money by, and all was bright as a new dollar. My God, whoever would have thought that it could have come to this? Whoever would have dreamed it? I used to be home for weekends very often, and sometimes if the ship were held back for cargo, I would have a whole week at a time. And in this way I saw a deal of my sister-in-law, Sarah. She was a fine, tall woman, black and fierce and quick, with a proud way of carrying her head, and a glint from her eye like a spark from a flint. But when little Mary was there, I had never thought of her, and that I swear I hope for God's mercy. It had seemed to me sometimes that she'd like to be alone with me, or to coax me out for a walk with her, but I had never thought anything of that. But one evening my eyes were opened. I had come home from the ship and found my wife out, but Sarah home. "Where's Mary?" I asked. "Oh, she has gone to pay some accounts." I was impatient and paced up and down the room. "Can't you be happy for 5 minutes without Mary, Jim?" she says. "It's a bad compliment to me that you can't be contented with my society for so short a time." "That's all right, my lass," said I, putting out my hand towards her in a kindly way. But she had it in both hers in an instant, and they burned as if they were all in a fever. I looked into her eyes, and I read it all there. There was no need for her to speak, nor for me either. I frowned and drew my hand away, and then she stood by my side in silence for a bit, and then she put her hand and patted me on the shoulder. "Steady, old Jim," said she. With a kind mocking laugh, she ran out of the room. Well, from that time Sarah hated me with her whole heart and soul, and she is a woman who can hate, too. I was a fool to let her go biding on with us, a besotted fool, but I never said a word to Mary, for I knew it would grieve her. Things went on much as before, but after a time I began to find that there was a bit of change in Mary herself. She had always been so trusting and so innocent, but now she became queer and suspicious, wanted to know where I had been, and what I had been doing, and to whom my letters were from, and what I had in my pockets, and a 1,000 such follies. Day by day she grew queerer and more irritable, and we had causeless rows about nothing. I was fairly puzzled by it all. Sarah avoided me now, but she and Mary were almost inseparable. I can see now that she was plotting and scheming and poisoning my wife's mind against me, but I was such a blind beetle that I could not understand it at the time. Then I broke my blue ribbon and began to drink again, and I think I should have done it if Mary had been the same as ever. She had some regard to be disgusted with me now, and the gap between us began to be wider and wider. And then this Alec Fairbairn chipped in, and things began 1,000 times blacker. It was to see Sarah that he came to my house first, but soon it was to see us, for he was a man with winning ways, and he made friends wherever he went. He was a dashing, swaggering chap, smart and curled, who had seen half the world, and could talk of what he had seen. He was good company, I won't deny it, and he was wonderfully polite ways with him of a sailor-man, so that I think there must have been a time when he knew more of the poop than of the forecastle. For a month he was in and out of my house, and never once did it cross my mind that harm might come of his soft, tricky ways. And then it was last something made me suspect, and from that day my peace was gone forever. It was a little thing, too. I had come to the parlour unexpected, and as I walked in the door I saw the light of a welcome in my wife's face. But as soon as she saw who it was, it faded again, and she turned away with a look of disappointment. That was enough for me. There was no one but Alec Fairbairn whose step she could have mistaken for mine. If I could have seen him, then I should have killed him, for I'd have always been like a madman when my temper gets loose. Mary saw the devil's light in my eyes, and she ran forward with her hands on my sleeve. "Don't, Jim, don't," says she. "Where's Sarah?" I asked. "In the kitchen," says she. "Sarah," says I, as I went in, "this man Fairbairn is to never darken my door again." "Why not?" says she. "Because I order it." "Oh," says she, "if my friends are not good enough for this house, then I am not good enough for it either." "You can do what you like," says I, "but if Fairbairn shows his face here again, I'll send one of his ears to you for a keepsake." She was frightened by my face, I think, for she never answered my word, and the same evening she left my house. Well, I don't know whether it was pure devilry on the part of this woman, or whether she thought that she could turn me against my wife by encouraging her to misbehave. Anyway, she took a house just a few streets off, and let lodgings to sailors. Fairbairn used to stay there, and Mary would go around to have tea with her sister and him. How often she went I don't know, but I followed her one day, and as I broke in the door, Fairbairn got away over the back garden wall, like a cowardly skunk that he is. I swore to my wife that I would kill her if I found her in his company again, and I led her back with me, sobbing and trembling as a white piece of paper. There was no trace of love between us any longer. I could see that she hated and feared me, and when the thought of it drove me to drink, then she despised me as well. Well, Sarah found that she could not make a living in Liverpool, so she went back, as I understand, to live with her sister in Croydon. Things jogged on the same as ever. And then came this last week, and all the misery and ruin. It was around this way. We had gone to the Mayday for a round voyage of 7 days, but a hogshead got loose and started on one of our plates, so we had to put back into the port for 12 hours. I left the ship and came home, thinking what a surprise it would be for my wife, and hoping that maybe she would be glad to see me so soon. The thought was in my head as I turned into my own street, and at that moment a cab passed me by, and there she was, sitting by the side of Fairbairn, the two chatting and laughing, with never a thought for me as I stood watching them on the footpath. I tell you that I gave my word to you that from that moment I did not know my own master. And it was all in a dim dream when I look back at it. I'd been drinking hard of late, and two things together fairly burned my brain. There's something throbbing in my head now, like a doctor's hammer. That morning I seemed to have all Nigeria whizzing and buzzing in my ears. Well, I took to my heels and ran after the cab. I had a heavy oak stick in my hand, and I tell you I saw red from the first. But as I ran, I got cunning too. I hung back a little to see them without being seen. They pulled up soon to the railway station. There was a good crowd to the booking office, so I got close enough behind them without being seen. They took tickets for New Brighton. So did I, but I got in 3 carriages behind them. When we reached it, they walked along the parade, and I was never more than 100 yards from them. At last I saw them hire a boat and start out for a row, for it was a very hot day, and they no doubt thought it would be cooler on the water. It was just as if they had been giving into my hands. There was a bit of a haze, and you could not see more than a few hundred yards. Yeah. I hired a boat myself, and I pulled after them. I could see the blur of their craft, but they were going nearly as fast as I, and they have been a long mile from shore before I caught them. The haze was like a curtain around us, and there was in the middle of it. My God. Shall I ever forget their faces when they saw who was in the boat that was closing upon them? She screamed out. He swore like a madman, and jabbed at me with an oar, for he must have seen death in my eyes. I got past it and got one with my stick, and crushed his head like an egg. I would have spared her, perhaps, for all my madness, but she threw her arms around him, crying out to him, calling him Alec. I struck again, and she lay stretched beside him. I was like a wild beast when there was a taste of blood. If Sarah had been there, by my lord, she would have joined them. I pulled out my knife, and, well, there. I've said enough. It gave me a kind of savage joy when I thought of how Sarah would feel when she had such signs of these that by her own meddling had brought about. Then I tied the bodies in the boat, stove a plank, and stood until they had sunk. I knew well that the owner would think that they had lost their bearings in the haze and had drifted out to sea. I cleaned myself up, got back to land, and joined my ship without a soul having suspicion of what had passed. That night I made up a packet for Sarah Cushing, and the next day I sent it out to Belfast. There you have it, the whole truth of it. You can hang me or do what you like with me, but you cannot punish me as I have already punished myself. I cannot shut my eyes to see those faces staring at me like they stared at me when the boat broke through the haze. I killed them quick, but they were killing me slow, and if I have another night of it, I shall either be mad or dead by morning. You won't put me alone in a cell, sir.
For pity's sake, don't, and you may be treated in your own day as agony as you treat me now. What is the meaning of it, Watson? Said Holmes solemnly as he laid down the paper. What object is served by the circle of misery and violence and fear? It must tend to an end, or else the universe is ruled by chance, which is unthinkable. But what end? There is a great standing perennial problem to which human reason is as far from an answer as ever.